The night was heavy with the sound of rain striking the windows, a storm thrashing against the fragile walls of the little house. Inside, Maria's hands shook as she folded a shirt into a worn leather bag, each movement slower than the last, as if prolonging time might somehow change what was inevitable. Behind her, in the dim light, Daniel sat in his wheelchair, his body still but his eyes wide with fear and longing. The accident had left him unable to walk, and in the months since, Maria had been his anchor, his strength, his reason to keep breathing. Now, with every item she packed, he felt that anchor slipping away. "I don't want to go," Maria whispered, her voice breaking as she turned to him. She dropped to her knees beside his chair, her hand clutching his. "They're forcing me to leave, Daniel. I swear I'll find a way back." The words were soaked in desperation, but Daniel only managed a faint smile, trying to mask the ache in his chest. He wanted to tell her it wasn't her fault, that he understood, but his throat locked around the words. When the bag was closed, she pressed her forehead against his, tears mingling with his silent grief. Then, with trembling steps, she rose and walked to the door. The storm outside howled, as though mourning with them. The final click of the door shutting echoed through the room like a hammer on stone, leaving Daniel in a silence that felt infinite. Days blurred into one another after Maria's departure, each one longer and heavier than the last. Daniel tried to keep a routine, but the smallest tasks became mountains. He struggled to reach the stove, burning his hand once as he fumbled with a pan. Meals shrank to whatever he could manage, cereal, dry bread, sometimes nothing at all. The walls that once echoed with Maria's laughter now pressed in on him, their silence deafening. Nights were the worst. He would sit by the window, watching shadows stretch across the yard, the loneliness creeping deeper with every hour. The bed felt too wide, the blankets too cold. Yet he refused to surrender to despair. On the small table beside him sat a framed photograph of Maria, smiling the way she always did when she tried to convince him that better days were ahead. Every night, without fail, he touched the frame and whispered her name, his voice soft but steady, "Maria." When exhaustion threatened to drag him into hopelessness, he clung to a single thought, that she hadn't left by choice. He repeated it like a prayer, a shield against despair, "She didn't abandon me. She was taken from me." It was this belief that kept him from collapsing entirely. His body grew weaker, his spirit frayed, but somewhere inside, a small flame of hope refused to be extinguished. And though no one knocked on his door, Daniel convinced himself that one day, somehow, the silence would break. One morning, after a night of fitful sleep, Daniel woke to a faint knock at the door. He hesitated, unsure if he had imagined it, until it came again, gentle but firm. With effort, he wheeled himself over and opened it to find Mrs. Carter, the elderly widow from across the street. She held a steaming pot in her hands, her eyes kind but cautious. "I thought you might need a warm meal," she said softly. Daniel blinked, startled, his throat tightening. For weeks he had managed in silence, unseen and untouched by the world outside. Now, standing before him, was an unexpected lifeline. The smell of soup filled the house, comforting in a way he hadn't felt since Maria left. Mrs. Carter didn't linger, but the next day she returned with bread. Soon after, others began to notice. A bag of groceries appeared on his porch. A neighbor quietly mowed his lawn. Another stopped by to fix a leaky roof shingle before the next rain. What began as one woman's kindness rippled through the town like sunlight breaking through clouds. At first, Daniel felt ashamed, guilty that others were carrying what he could not. But slowly, the shame gave way to something else, gratitude, and a dawning realization that he was not invisible, not forgotten. The loneliness that had once suffocated him began to lift, replaced by a sense of connection he hadn't expected. He realized that while tragedy had taken Maria away, humanity itself was stepping in to hold him up. It was on a quiet afternoon, when the air was warm and still, that the letter arrived. Daniel found it tucked in the mailbox, the handwriting on the envelope so familiar his hands trembled before he even opened it. He wheeled himself inside, the paper clutched tightly, afraid it might vanish if he let go. Sitting at the table, he tore it open and unfolded the page with a reverence usually reserved for sacred things. The words leapt at him. Shaky, hurried, but undeniably hers. Daniel, I never wanted to leave you. They threatened me, and I had no choice. But I am safe now. Hold on for me. I'm coming back to you. His vision blurred as tears spilled freely, dripping onto the page, smudging the ink. For the first time in months, the silence around him didn't feel empty. It felt alive with promise. When neighbors heard about the letter, their response was immediate. Mrs. Carter organized small gatherings to keep Daniel company, while others began repairing the house, painting walls, planting flowers in the yard. They wanted Maria to return to a home filled with warmth, not the shadowed silence she had left behind. Even people who had barely spoken to Daniel before found themselves drawn into the effort, moved by the story of two souls torn apart yet still holding on to love. For Daniel, every nail hammered, every flower planted was proof. He had not only Maria waiting to return, he had a community waiting to welcome her home. The morning air carried the sweetness of spring, the kind that made the world feel new again. Daniel sat at the edge of the driveway, his wheelchair angled toward the road, his heart pounding like a drum he couldn't quiet. Around him stood the neighbors who had become his family, Mrs. Carter clutching a handkerchief, children bouncing with excitement, men and women smiling softly, all waiting with him. Then, at last, a figure appeared at the end of the street. Maria. Her steps were hesitant at first, as though afraid the moment might dissolve into a dream. But when her eyes met Daniel's, her pace quickened, her bag slipping from her shoulder as she ran the final stretch. Daniel reached out, his hands trembling, and when she fell into his arms, the world seemed to still. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent he thought he might never know again, while she whispered through tears, "I told you I'd come back." The crowd erupted in applause, some laughing, some openly weeping. Neighbors who had once been strangers now clapped each other on the back, their faces lit with joy. The flowers in the yard swayed gently in the breeze, as if nodding in approval of the reunion. In that instant, Daniel understood something deeper than survival. Love had brought Maria back, but kindness had carried him through. What began as tragedy ended as proof that compassion can hold broken lives together until they are whole again.